Hi, students. In continuing our theme of things that should not be branded but are, we are this week talking about branding the self. This is all about brand you. Basically, we want to talk about what are the consequences of thinking about ourselves as a brand. Are we brands? Should we be brands? Can we escape being brands? Should a promotional logic apply to people? Let's start by talking about what is brand you, and then we'll talk about the specifics as they relate to the digital environment, and then finally a little bit of takeaways for what you can think about this topic. The first is that, really in this day and age, it's almost a bit of an evil necessity that we have to consider ourselves as brands, especially if you're going to want to work in what's called the knowledge economy. If you're going to want to work in creative industries, the promotional industries, if you're going to have a public facing type of career where you are going to be working in promotion or representing brands or clients, it's sort of not just a what's called a social compulsion. We don't just brand ourselves because we sort of feel like we have to socially, but actually because it's an economic necessity. It's actually your brand, and the value of that brand is going to be a deciding factor in how successful your career is. And so, unfortunately, if by working in these fields, it's something that we can't really avoid. And Gandini's piece, which is the reading this week, which is such a good one, basically talks about how, especially as we converge in the knowledge economy on this sort of freelance-based work, project-based work, the gig economy, where you're constantly hustling for new projects and new jobs, and nothing is nothing is secure for the long term. You've got to be constantly working on your professional image, and you've got to be networking, and the networking is going to be based on the management of your social relationships. And the management of those social relationships is for the express purpose of professional success. So again, you can't just have friends anymore. You've got to have a network. And your network has to be the right kind of people who are going to be able to get you the right kind of results in your career and profession. So it's not even just about just enjoying someone's company anymore. It's about, what can you give me? What can I get out of you? How am I going to gain from this relationship? So we start to see our relationships as very transactional. And again, as a means or a tool for us to progress ourselves professionally, and not necessarily just as something that is meaningful in our lives. Now, if we're going to understand what self-branding is really all about and how it actually starts to implement itself and what it looks and feels like, you have to go back to Goffman. Now, Goffman was a sociologist who was writing mostly in the 1950s and 60s, and he talked about the presentation of the self. And what he was really interested in is this idea that we have front stage personas, and we have the backstage. So the front stage is where we put ourselves, we perform, we put an armor on ourselves, or some sort of costume, where we present ourselves in a way that is palatable for other people, and we present ourselves in the way that we want them to see us. And then when we are away from the public eye and we are in our homes, in our bathrobes, and no one can see us, that's the backstage. And in order for us to be our best front stage selves, we have to go backstage and just let it all hang out, basically, so that we can regroup and refill ourselves so that we have the energy to get back out there in performance. And he talks a lot about how, we use this tool of impression management. So we're very much trying to manage people's impressions of us through the presentation of our idealized self, rather than who we are authentically. And, we all do this. We do this for our parents, for our colleagues, for our friends, for people that we're meeting at parties. We do it sort of subconsciously. And this is what he talked about, is about the subconscious presentation of the self, where we're constantly switching back and forth between backstage and front stage in a way to manage people's impression of us. because people's impressions of us matter, and we want to be liked and we want to be accepted in society. And so in order to do that, we are constantly adapting our behavior to be in a performance that will make us acceptable. This is what we do as human beings, and we always have been. As I said, he was writing about this 50 years ago, and it was quite a game changer in terms of people understanding how we see ourselves, because everyone likes to think that you're authentically you all the time. But the reality is that you're not. You're adapting your behavior to fit the context and to fit the people that you're around. Now, what happens if you take this concept of the presentation of the self and you put it in a digital context? We start to think about the fact that, we are constantly presenting ourselves online. And what ends up happening is that we end up having different presentations of ourselves in different contexts. Well, what happens when you take those contexts and you put them in an online environment? So you have one presentation of yourself on Twitter, another on Facebook, another on Instagram, another on TikTok, and another through email, for example. And so Hogan talks about the fact that actually, we end up starting to see our relationships with people very differently, because they're no longer just friends that we share common bonds with or commonalities with, but they are actually people with whom we want to manage access to content about ourselves. And this really makes our relationships different, because if all of a sudden you start to see the people that you interact with as simply repositories for content that you're creating about yourself, that becomes a very imbalanced relationship where they are passive consumers of your content rather than your friends or your family. But this is basically what we've all started to do now. As we have these growing lists of friends in our socials, we start to actually not see them as friends and start to see them as simply followers. And so this can really have an impact on, how we actually view our relationships in real life. Now, the digital environment actually adds a whole bunch of other layers of complexity. The first is that we're no longer bounded by time, space, or geography. So again, our relationships used to be very much based on who you spent the most time with, hanging out in your living room, having meals with, doing things with, and your relationships were bounded by those types of parameters around, say, time, space, and place. Well, online, none of that exists anymore. So you could have friends who live all over the world in any type of time zone. You could be expected to talk to them at any hour of the day. You could go weeks, months, and not speak to them and then pick up like nothing's happened. And so, again, there's more facets of layers of how our relationships come to be. We're also constantly observed online. So there's this continuous observation that occurs between individuals where you're looking at what they post on Facebook, or you're scrolling their Insta photos, and you're just constantly kind of aware of people's lives. And our lives are a lot more on display now than they used to be. So this provides people with an opportunity to more closely curate the content that they share about their lives. And so this isn't news, but we're not getting an accurate picture of who somebody actually is by these heavily curated images that they choose to share with us strategically in their quest to manage our impression of themselves, or to manage the access to content about them that we receive. And you also have to remember that the content that we are consuming about people is delivered through a third party, such as Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. So it's not direct engagement. It is literally filtered through this platform that is designed to show things in a certain way, in a box a certain size, with a certain time frame attached to it, with a certain number of characters. So again, you're not getting an accurate or authentic representation of the person. You're getting it very much decided and designed by the platform through which they decide to communicate with you. And so the other thing that happens about this is that the person who's sharing content doesn't ever really know who their audience is. They don't know when they're being observed, who's observing them. They don't know if the content is being shared with other people that they don't really know. You have very little control over how you are actually being watched or observed, even though you feel like you're managing the content that you're sharing. So again, this gives you people a very skewed perspective about who their friends are and what their relationships are, and even frankly, how they come across in these platforms, because it's uncontrolled. There's no way to actually know what people are seeing, when they're seeing it. You could be sharing all kinds of content, but if people are not online, that content doesn't get on their feed, and then they never know it. So you can't just assume that everyone has an accurate portrayal, or at least even the portrayal of that you're trying to portray. People just you just don't know what information people have access to, especially when you start to take algorithms into the mix. I'm always surprised when I post some big news on Facebook that names that are coming out of the woodwork, liking or posting on my commenting on my post, and you think, God, I haven't even thought about that person in 7 years. I forgot they were even my friend, and yet they still have access to this content, and you just don't know. The other thing to remember about this is that, all of this work that we put into managing our own content about how we're perceived online is work. It is work. And so self-branding is very much a form of digital labor that we all have to engage in now if you're going to make a name for yourself, if you're going to become a brand. And so Gandini also talks about the fact that, we end up investing in these social relationships with the expectation of a return because we're working and you don't work for free. So there's this expectation that if you're going to spend all of this time managing your brand and, putting yourself out there and being on brand with all of your messaging and your socials, and you've got all these huge networks that you're maintaining through these different platforms, at some point, you're going to want to get a return on all that investment of time. And that means that you're going to want to feel at least you could get a job, or that you have contacts, or that you have a positive reputation. And it doesn't always work that way, because at the end of the day, you're working with people, and people can't be controlled in that way. And you can't simply invest in your relationships with an expectation of return in the same way that you can invest your money, for example. So, but instead of money, your self-branding and the relationships that you're building in the reputation economy end up becoming your form of social capital. And social capital is essentially the value of all of your relationships and how you can use those relationships as a way to further yourself professionally, or financially. And again, this comes back to, are they friends and family, or are they simply members of my social capital that contribute to my economic well-being? And am I simply using these relationships as a way to get ahead? And is that really any way to live authentically with the people around you? But at the end of the day, brand you exists, and you will learn very much over the course of your degree that your brand matters. You've got to have a brand, you've got to be consistent with your brand, you've got to pay attention, and you've got to spend time building your brand, especially if you're going to make it in this economy. So, basically this idea that, you have to curate your online branded persona, and you've got to spend time on the strategic management of your social relationships as a way to mobilize your social capital and build a network of people that will eventually help you in your career. That's what Brand You is all about. And you are in the situation where you've really basically got to consider yourself a brand, and think of all of the brand touch points where you interact with people and what their experience of you is, whether that's on a social channel or in real life. And you've got to make sure that your brand is consistent and compelling. So as if you didn't have enough to worry about in life, now you've got to think about your own brand as well. Some considerations when you are actually in this environment and you're thinking about your own brand. Well, a lot of the things you have to kind of consider are the public versus private self. How much of your private self do you want to have public? How much of your public self represents your private self? Are they the same? Can you afford to have them the same? Is this something that you are very careful about managing your public persona and keeping some certain things back in your private life that are simply reserved for your closest friends and family in a real world context? These are all issues that you as digital natives have constantly been dealing with. But again, as you start to enter into a professional world, this is something that has even more resonance because you can't afford to ruin your potential career on some bad mistakes sharing personal content that never should have seen the light of day. So the sooner you can decide what the line is for you between your public and private self, and the sooner you can decide how you're going to manage that content on your various platforms, the better. And this really just comes down to knowing yourself and knowing how much you're comfortable with sharing. You also have to spend some energy on strategic relationship management. Now, this basically comes down to making sure that on whatever platforms you're sharing content, there you have the appropriate audiences on those platforms. So, for example, my Facebook is quite private and I don't use my real name on it, but it's basically all of the friends I've met over many years at parties and travels and everything else, and I've collected. That's Facebook for me. It's a personal account and I only share really mostly personal information on there. Twitter is my professional account. It's where I share information about politics, information about my students, classes I'm teaching, place branding things, whatever I'm interested in professionally. That's where I share that content on Twitter. And I don't have a large audience, but it's generally an audience that is going to be looking for that kind of content from me. Instagram is where I share juicing and food photos. So, I'm really into health food. I'm really into juicing. I'm into exercise and healthy living. And I tend to want to share information about that there. And that's just a bit of a passion project. And I don't really share anything else that's related to the rest of my life on that platform. That's a decision that I've made and that works for me. But you need to figure out how you're going to maintain your relationships and where those relationships are going to reside and what your brand is and how you can leverage those relationships to help you further your career without actually using people as well. Because the best networking happens when it's organic and friendly and kind and generous and authentic and real. Nobody wants to feel like they're being used for professional gain. So careful about that. And then finally, pay attention to how much time you're spending on this. At the end of the day, this is free, unpaid labor that you are expected to do as a result of working in the attention and knowledge economies. And we're all susceptible to having to have a brand, a self brand. But at the end of the day, it is an investment of your time and your energy, and it is an investment in you, and therefore it's important. But you can't automatically and necessarily expect there to be a return on that investment the same way that you would by spending time actually at a job where you're getting paid money or with a client where they're actually paying you to do this. So just be mindful about how much time you spend on your personal brand and try to be more strategic about doing the things that are going to result in the biggest payoff for you. Some things to take away from this. At the end of the day, it's unpaid labor, it's a ton of work, it's hard to do, and it treats relationships as transactions. It actually also leads to worsening mental health as we're constantly comparing ourselves to other people and whether or not our brand is strong enough. And one would argue, should self-branding even be a thing? Should we even be talking about it? And that is something I want to discuss in our class together. The reality is it is a thing and it's something that we can't escape. But again, the same as with everything else we've talked about, there's this promotional logic that has injected itself into the very fiber of our identity. And by seeing ourselves as brands and by seeing our relationships as social capital, we have lost our humanity. And we've lost our ability to just be human. And so is it really, should we play this game? Do we have to? Is this something that we should be doing? And if we have to, and it does appear that there is an element of that, how do we do it in a way that is ethical? How do we do it in a way that doesn't mean we lose ourselves or that we have still a fine, or at least a solid line between our personal lives and our professional lives. How do we maintain our own identities in the face of having to also have a branded identity? And these are all questions that we all have to ask ourselves these days. Goffman had it right when he talked about the fact that, being front stage is exhausting, and you need to be able to go backstage sometimes to regenerate yourself and recuperate. And if we are on front stage in our socials 24/7 all the time, at what point do you completely lose yourself and burn out? Some food for thought. I hope you enjoyed this lecture, and I look forward to speaking to you about it.